Now, we got it wrong aren't words feedback listeners hear very often. But this week, in an interview with the Radio Times, the Veteran Today presenter John Humphrys claimed that the broadly liberal BBC hadn't been sufficiently sceptical in the past on the issues of Europe and immigration. Many of our correspondents agree with him.
Hello, my name is James Pennington. I can't say that I was surprised to hear that news. In fact, I approach BBC News now the same as I would a newspaper. I have to be aware of its biases and process it accordingly. I expect it to see the world from its comfortable position in the liberal left, cosmopolitan London culture, in how it reports things and in the things it reports.
Hello, my name's Phil Saunders. I think the people who work in the BBC, they've managed to immunise themselves against those nasty oiks that are the public. The BBC is not taking dissenting voices sufficiently seriously, and I don't think they're taking the time to listen to their listeners in a constructive way.
John Humphrys also went on to say that the BBC was grotesquely overmanaged. The BBC's long-standing critics lapped it up, and his comments were, predictably, headline news in a number of newspapers, many of which are keen to see a smaller BBC and the end of the licence fee. Was Mr. Humphrys accurately reported? And if so, does he regret the timing of his remarks? I caught up with him shortly after he came off air on Thursday morning and asked him first whether he had been correctly quoted.
Pretty much. Well, maybe not the grotesquely, maybe that was a little bit of hyperbole, but seriously, let's substitute seriously overmanaged.
Seriously overmanaged.
It is getting better, I have to say that, Roger. Things are improving. You do see, well, you don't necessarily see the odd head rolling, but you do see a few changes coming along, and slightly, I think, fewer managers, though I haven't counted them all. It's the sense you get.
There is a question mark about whether you should say it publicly at this time, because...
Why not? Public money.
Well, some people would say, one, there's a campaign going against the BBC, and therefore you're aiding its enemies. That's one argument.
Well, I think that's nonsense. Can I deal with that one?
Please do.
Because, of course, it's nonsense, aiding its enemies. The idea that presenters like me, or anybody in the BBC, should take the view that the BBC is owned by the managers or by some other force than the licence payers is, and that is grotesque. The BBC, and it'll sound pompous, forgive me, the BBC is owned by the viewers and the listeners, the licence payers, and they should be told what people who work for the BBC think about it. They have a right to know that, it seems to me. And it's not being disloyal, it's being exactly the opposite, it's being loyal.
And it's music to my ears, and but there would be... it would be, and therefore when I also read in the paper you occasionally contribute to the Mail that David Dimbleby has been told to go easy on the Labour Party person in a question time discussion. Well, you know what David would do to that.
Yeah,
you would do what I would
absolutely
do.
There'd be a very short sentence delivered, I think, the second word of which would be off.
So when, people say admit conspiracies in the BBC about this and that, have you been part of a conspiracy on Europe or on immigration or anything
No,
like that?
I haven't. But what I've detected, and more importantly, much more importantly, what a very large number of our viewers and listeners have detected over the years, is that we have been broadly liberal. That's the phrase I used.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is when we have considered Europe, for instance, we've considered it... Look, let me go back just a step. I was born during the war, and I was brought up in a country that was terrified of war happening again. That was the thing that scared us all. It was always there. The spectre was always there during my childhood and my youth as well, for that matter. And anything that came along that might result in no more wars in Europe was to be welcomed, was to be embraced, was to be encouraged. And so when the European Union came along, a lot of us thought, absolutely wonderful. No more war in Europe. Simplistic,
but John,
I know.
But the point surely is this. It's not what people may feel in the BBC, it's whether they control those feelings and remain as objective as possible. So to make the claim that the BBC was liberal is to say that its policies and its decision-making were liberal, not necessarily that those...
No, I think it's to make the claim that the mindset was liberal. So when somebody might suggest, on this programme or others, let's do so-and-so, a particular politician who was known for his anti-European, his sceptical views, people would tend to say, a bit bonkers, isn't he? Well, maybe not. And maybe he wouldn't then be interviewed. So it wasn't rampant. I didn't suggest in that conversation, the Radio Times conversation, that it was rampant, that we were kind of foaming at the mouth, pro-Europeans, federalists to a man and woman. We weren't, but there was a mindset that thought that the right approach to Europe should be supportive. So, no, of course there was no conspiracy, but it was a mindset. It was an approach. And I think if you do an analysis of our coverage during those years, I think that's the impression you would gain as well.
Isn't the problem for you in particular, you've expressed the view that the BBC's grotesquely overmanaged and has a liberal bias, or had a liberal bias, and people will remember how tough you were with the former Director General, no suggesting that you're on his side or the BBC side's there. But isn't the problem next time you do something about the future of the BBC, which is a really contentious issue, there's a danger that those who want to cut down the BBC will say, and John, you agree with this, don't you, because you said it's grotesquely overmanaged. So by expressing your views on this issue, haven't you compromised your ability to conduct a discussion about the future size, makeup and nature of the BBC?
I don't think so, because I was talking about the BBC as it was, and I also said it is changing, so that if I were to interview somebody who said, you think it's grotesquely overmanaged, let's get over the word grotesquely if we can, therefore, what should be done about it? Well, I would say I'm not going to answer that question, because I don't provide the answers, just the questions.
No, they'll quote you. The point I'm making, John, and it is difficult, isn't it, for all presenters, if they express themselves forcibly on a matter of public contention and debate, when they come to chair something in which they're required to be seen as objective, they are compromised.
Well, on some issues, you'd be absolutely right. I don't, for instance, conduct interviews on assisted dying, which is a hugely contentious area, and I've written a book about it, and I have views about it, and I told the BBC I was writing the book, and they said fine, and I agreed without hesitation. I suggested that I shouldn't do interviews on it, and of course I don't. So, BBC is different. We are all the BBC. That's my point. And I was entitled, even as a presenter of the BBC, on the BBC, I was entitled to have a view, which is that it was overmanaged. We are beginning to get on top of it now. The Director General thinks it was overmanaged. Everybody in the BBC thinks it was overmanaged. Maybe still is. Maybe some more work needs to be done. I don't think that's contentious, and I think it would be po-faced for me to say, oh, I am not going to express a view on that. Everybody knows what I think anyway. Certainly in this place they do. I've not made a secret of it for the last
and just
decades.
Finally, for the record, has any editor ever told you to go soft on a political interviewee?
Nope.
Has anybody ever told you to go soft on the question of immigration?
Nope.
Has anybody ever told you to go soft on the question of Europe?
Nope. But that doesn't prove the point, Roger, because I don't edit the programmes, I don't decide who gets interviewed, and that is crucial to it.
Our thanks to John Humphrys, fresh as a daisy after 3 hours on the air.